Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the BEREC public debriefing, the last one of this year. We will present the outcomes of our 61st ordinary plenary meetings held in Ljubljana last week. Before we proceed with the presentation, I would like to give you a short explanation of the format of the public debriefing and how you can interact. We have received questions sent by email before the event, and we will answer these questions. And you can also ask your questions via chat box to be answered during the Q&A sessions. There will be 2 Q&A sessions after each part of the public debriefing. So questions related to the topics presented during the first part of the public debriefing will be answered immediately, and all other questions will be answered during the second Q&A session. Next slide, please. During the first part, we will present the documents for public consultation. We have a number of documents to present today, so I will not read the whole list. Instead, I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Tom Boyce, an incoming CN chair, to present the final BEREC Work Program 2025. Tom will do it on behalf of our 2025 chair, Robert, who couldn't join us today. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tonko. I presume I can be heard. Next slide, please. Just a quick overview. The BEREC Work Program for 2025 now includes 50 projects. There's 31 recurring projects, or mandatory or carryover. What we mean by recurring projects are typically the roaming benchmarking reports, the annual calculation of the WACC parameters, and so forth. The mandatory projects that I refer to are those that BEREC is obliged to do under legislation, for example, produce guidelines under the Gigabit Infrastructure Act. And finally, we have projects that have commenced in 2024 and will conclude in 2025. So on top of these 31 recurring projects are mandatory, we have 19 new projects that will start in 2025. Some will carry over in a similar manner to 2026. The 19 includes an external study on data centers. We've had a public consultation on the work program that ran from the 4th of October to the 4th of November, and the submissions that we received are from the 15 stakeholders listed on the slide. Next slide, please. What I'm going to set out here in the next 2 slides is the changes that have been made to the work program following the public consultation. We have amended project 5.2.1, which is an ad hoc project, and it is to emphasize to our stakeholders and to highlight that this project is BEREC's input to the review of the code. It's a very highly rated project. It is a severe importance for us, and that we are going to devote all the resources that is required. So the change is not to any output, but rather to the text to reflect the importance of this project. In project 1.1, it's just a change in the timing. It will go for public consultation at plenary 1 in March rather than plenary 2 in June. And this is to spread the load across the year, both for the working group and for stakeholders. We have made a substantial change to project 1.11. We will produce a report at plenary 2, which will be finalized at plenary 4, rather than leaving it as an ad hoc item with no specific deliverable as we consulted on. And the final project on this slide is 2.5. It essentially has been completed. The summary report on the external workshop that we held will be published today, and the project therefore does not carry forward into next year. So next slide, please. Okay, we have a new project 2.5, a renumbered one, and again, this is a similar change. We are going to produce a report on the integration of AI in the telecommunications sector. So we have a specific deliverable. It will go for public consultation in P3, whereas when we consulted, we had no specific deliverable. So we firmed up our thinking on this during the consultation project. We have amended the text to the BEREC strategies to reflect the direct link between BEREC strategies and the code and broader alignment with EU policy goals. So just a change of text. We have added a project. We have gained one project, and this is 5.3.5, which is an opinion on the Implementing Act on intra-EU communications. This work was expected to be concluded in 2024 this year, but it looks like now it will spill over into 2025, so we've included it on that basis. And finally, we've just refreshed the text and updated it based text related to the stakeholder forum and the communications plan. So next slide, please. So if I might summarize then, there are, for stakeholders' benefit, there are 13 public consultations across the year. There are 2 public consultations in plenary 1 in March. There are 4 public consultations in plenary 2 in June. 2 of those were handed to BEREC or mandated. BEREC will do them under the Gigabit Infrastructure Act. There are 3 public consultations in plenary 3 in October. There are 2 in December. And finally, the very bottom one there is the timing of update to BEREC guidelines and geographical service network deployments. We can't finalize the time of that based on existing work that working group is doing, but we will make it known to stakeholders as soon as possible. And next slide, please. And finally, just to flag for stakeholders too, that there are 7 external workshops. There was 1 in Q1. There's none in Q2. Sorry, 4 in Q2. Excuse me. And 3 in Q3. I think that's too many. But anyway, you can do the maths yourselves. We thought it would be worthwhile to flag on this slide the various touch points that we plan to have with stakeholders during the year on a broad range of topics, from end users' rights to sustainability, cybersecurity, and then with the kind of the more core task of related to equivalence of inputs by NRAs. And that's it. That's the conclusion of the summary of the work program following the public consultation. Back to you, Tonko.
Thank you, Tom. And I will just pass the floor to our Sustainability Working Group co-chairs, Katerina and Sandrine, to present us draft BEREC report on infrastructure sharing as a lever for ECN, ECS environmental sustainability. Katerina and Sandrine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tonko, and very good afternoon to you all. We are happy to present to you the draft report on infrastructure sharing as a lever for electronic communications environmental sustainability. First, some elements of context. BEREC has identified in its previous reports and opinions infrastructure sharing as one of the levers and regulatory tool to support the deployment of greener electronic communications infrastructures. In order to detail the sustainability aspects of infrastructure sharing agreements and related decisions, the project of this draft report was included in BEREC work program for this year. More specifically, it aims to analyzing the implementation of EU provisions related to infrastructure sharing to evaluate whether environmental considerations are assessed. It also seeks to review existing work and studies on the topic and to identify the possible needs. Another objective is gathering NRA's feedback on weighing up the environmental benefits of infrastructure sharing, while also considering the potential legal and technical issues it can raise. The draft report capitalized on past work of BEREC regarding infrastructure sharing and sustainability, especially BEREC Common Position on Infrastructure Sharing, BEREC Report assessing its role limiting the impact of digital sector on the environment, and BEREC Opinion regarding BCRD recast and the GIA. It is based also on questionnaire distributed among BEREC members in April of this year, as well as on a technical workshop with stakeholders. For example, among the participants were ECTA, Connect Europe, and the European Wireless Infrastructure Association. We invited also other two associations, which did not reply to this initiative, but we invite them and all other stakeholders to submit their inputs in the upcoming public consultation. We can go to next slide. Thank you. From the feedback of BEREC members, the draft report confirms that all the provisions studied have been transposed. Regarding Article 44, most of national acts mention the environment as a possible basis for infrastructure sharing obligations, but between 2 to 7 NRAs actually imposed infrastructure sharing obligations on the basis of various regulatory provisions. For example, Articles 44 and 67 of the Code or spectrum licenses. Nevertheless, it was concluded that environmental aspects are rarely part of the decision-making process on infrastructure sharing. The working group also attempted to collect quantitative data from NRAs on fixed and mobile infrastructure sharing, but as you can see on this slide, the data received, for example, here for mobile infrastructure, only relatively comparable data is represented on these graphs. It can also be noted from NRAs and stakeholders' feedback that only a few studies exist on the environmental aspects of infrastructure sharing, even though there is a consensus that these practices have a positive impact. The large majority of NRAs mentioned also in their questionnaire that they are interested in further investigating how they could contribute to building more sustainable digital infrastructures by infrastructure sharing regulation. This holds true as long as the consequences in terms of competition, investment, quality of service are evaluated, monitored, and mitigated where applicable. I will now ask my colleague Sandrine to continue in our presentation.
Thank you. We can go to the next slide, please. So we will now present to you the main conclusions from this draft report. So first, the draft report outlined the various benefits from infrastructure sharing in terms of cost reduction, improved transparency, acceptability, and also, of course, to minimize the environmental footprint of telecom infrastructures. The draft report also insists on the fact that these benefits have to be weighed against potential drawbacks in terms of quality of service, competition, and investment. We also recall that the European framework provides regulatory tools to support infrastructure sharing, and that infrastructure sharing is also already part of commercially driven agreements within the industry. But we also mention that the use of the regulatory tools to support infrastructure sharing are quite disparate among regulators and relatively scarce in some certain cases. And the environmental aspects are rarely part of the decision-making of regulators in applying these regulatory tools. And as mentioned, there is also a lack of data and studies evaluating the environmental benefits from infrastructure sharing. We can go to the next slide, please. So from these observations, the BEREC draft report insists on the fact that adding an environmental sustainability objective in the regulatory mandate of NRAs will be a favorable development to facilitate the inclusion of environmental aspects in NRAs decisions, including when they relate to infrastructure sharing. This is not a new position from BEREC, as we already did support this proposal from the European Commission white paper on the future of digital infrastructures. And we also mentioned that the possibility to expand the capacity of NRAs to encourage infrastructure sharing and its environmental benefits could be a relevant topic to examine during the next review of the European Electronic Communication Code. Also, from the feedback of NRAs, we mentioned that additional guidance at EU level could be a mean to support regulators that will be motivated to include sustainability aspects in their decision-making related to infrastructure sharing. And for future work, we also acknowledge the importance to promote the share of best practices and data, including within BEREC, and to support the conduct of studies evaluating the environmental impact of infrastructure sharing. We can go to the next slide. So the public consultation on this BEREC draft report on infrastructure sharing as a level for ICN and ICS sustainability will be open from December 16 to January 26. So we look forward to read and take into account your valuable inputs on this work. Thank you very much, and I pass the floor back to FNE co-chairs Alexander Thelen and François Weber.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Sandrine. We would now like to present to you the main findings of the draft BEREC Progress Report on managing copper network switch off. Please. On this slide, you can see the projects on migration and copper switch off over the last 5 years, which is testament to BEREC's very strong focus on this very important topic. And the report we are discussing today and will consult after with you builds on the 2022 BEREC report on a consistent approach to migration and copper switch off. Slide, please. This slide shows the copper switch off status based on decisions taken according to Article 81 EECC by NRAs. So in 17 countries, the SMP operator plans to switch off copper-based access networks. In 18 countries, our survey showed that the SMP operator already closed copper-based access, copper-based network elements, and 20 countries, NRAs have rules for migration process and copper switch off. These numbers reflect copper switch off according to Article 81. They do not on the copper switch off status in markets without SMP operators. Next slide, please. Now I would like to provide some key information on rules for migration and copper switch off that NRAs have set. In general, rules are imposed based on market analysis decisions and are applied at MDF level. It is important that NRAs set rules for appropriate notice periods, and they tend to vary because of the needs of network operators. So these notice periods typically are 6 to 12 months in case alternative network operators do not use any SMP operators copper-based wholesale access products. Notice periods are a bit longer, 1.5 to 2 years in case alternative network operators use VULA or Bitstream. And the longest notice periods we typically find in case alternative network operators use copper-based unbundling. Next slide, please. On this slide, you can see alternative wholesale access products that SMP operators have to opt. One thing that is quite clear is that a certain variety of wholesale products have to be provided by the SMP operator, with VULA at local level being the most adopted service. Sometimes, for example, in France, however, the availability of a wholesale access product is necessary for the switch off, but it can also be provided by another operator than the SMP operator. But this is the reason why France, for example, does not appear in this table. And then finally, I would like to mention that NRAs identified various specific moments in time when the alternative wholesale access product must be made available. And there are 3 main options that NRAs have taken in terms of the timing. for the availability. And so the first option is a group of NRAs. They have tied this to the switch off announcement. Others have tied the timing to the timing of the commercial closure. And finally, a group of NRAs has tied this event to the timing of the final switch off. And then next slide, please. The report also clearly shows that information of alternative network operators is of absolute critical importance for the success of a migration process and finally the copper switch off. Beyond the common switch off plan, other examples of data that are expected include, for example, information on technologies, the identification of lines, information on and changes to coverage, information on legacy and alternative wholesale access products, and also a list of exceptions, which are very important, of course, for alternative network operators. And with that, I would like to hand over to François. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. So compared to the last report, we have some progress and more implementation of copper switch off. So we added a section in our questionnaire to NRAs about feedback from what has already happened. And what appeared in the answers was that the most critical action to be taken was about communication, and whenever possible, neutral communication. The stakeholders doing this communication tend to vary between NRAs, governments, operators, all of them. But basically, that's what appears to be key, even though it's also in the feedbacks we got what was considered by many NRAs to be the place where there is most room for improvement, especially because it is often hard to reach the end users, and reaching the end users is key, not only reaching alternative operators. Then the regulatory framework also appeared quite important for the success, especially to limit the number of service interruptions, which can create some turmoil during the copper switch off process. The most efficient one was long enough notice periods, but also ensuring VHC and alternative products are available was considered key by most NRAs. And finally, data sharing, Alexander just mentioned, was often seen as also crucial, especially to avoid competition issues and facilitate targeted actions to boost migrations. And so there are different stakeholders concerned with this data sharing, but one of the key is data sharing between the SMPO and alternative operators. Next slide, please. And finally, since we started this report just after the European Commission released its white paper, we consulted the NRAs about the target, which is suggested in this report, to have 2030 copper switch off all across Europe, and an intermediate goal in 2028. What appeared is that with the current dynamic, so without no new action, 10 NRAs are confident in reaching this target. At the opposite, in 14 countries, it has not even been starting. So our view is that it's probably linked to also the various situations for fiber development. There are various difficulties in some countries with weather conditions, with a lack of civil infrastructure. So uniform target might not be the most efficient tool, and we believe improving the results would need to take into account the variability of the situations. And in any case, as we said in our view on the white paper, we believe that the feedback is that we have to protect the end users. For that, we have to have adequate notice periods and make sure there is a substitution VHCN products available. So these two necessities, before setting any political target, should be taken into account. Next slide, please. So these are the main findings of the report. Thank you for listening. It's going to be released in the next days, and we will offer the possibility to comment on it until 31st of January. And then we aim to adopt a final report in June. Thank you, and I give back the floor to the next team.
Okay, so then I will start. Thank you, Francois, and good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to present to you the work that the Market and Economic Analysis Expert Working Group has been doing in the field of regulation of physical infrastructure access. So next slide, please. This slide covers the context of BEREC's work in the field. So as you may remember, BEREC has previously looked at the physical infrastructure access regulation in 2019. However, since then, the markets have evolved, with 5 EU countries identifying PIA standalone markets in 2023 and 2024. Therefore, one may argue that PIA's importance in the value chain of the provision of electronic communication services has grown lately. At the same time, PIA can be identified as the most upstream market, its regulation having an impact on all the relevant markets downstream that may be identified. For instance, in some countries, we have noticed that PIA regulation has been used as a leverage for deregulation of certain downstream markets, which were typically geographically segmented. Another important point to be made is that a significant portion of the costs associated with the very high capacity networks rollout is dependent on the physical infrastructure elements used. Clearly enough, it does make a difference whether the networks are dug up or rolled out aerially, whether the necessary physical infrastructure is self-built or bought on a commercial basis, or whether a mix of these means is used in different geographic areas. Another point is that in terms of applicable legislation, we have seen a strengthening provisions concerning PIA, both in the code as well as in the recently adopted Gigabit Infrastructure Act. And finally, in a context in which urbanistic rules are getting stricter, the access to non-telecommunications network operators' physical infrastructure becomes more relevant for the network's deployment. And this is one of the angles BEREC has a closer look at in the current draft report. Therefore, in order to inform this activity, BEREC has sent a comprehensive questionnaire to its members, with 29 countries having contributed. The data was collected as of July 2024. Another point that needs to be made is that while recognizing PIA's importance for the rollout of mobile networks, this BEREC draft report is focused on fixed very high capacity networks. And at times, we also make reference to the backhaul segment that of course could be used for the deployment of both types of networks. Noteworthy, despite the fact that the report touches on symmetric regulation, the perspective taken is primarily that of the S&P regime. More concretely, the question on whether the former is considered enough to ensure an effective competitive environment is tackled. If we could go to the next slide, please. So, the current draft report looks at several relevant aspects, such as the trends in PIA provision and the corresponding take-up. And while we see that PIA is broadly available for the use of telecom operators, 26 out of 29 NRAs confirmed that it was so, we notice that the take-up is not always in accordance. However, the reasons for this vary in nature and are by and large country specific. So this situation exists only in a minority of countries. We have also looked at the options that the operators choose when using physical infrastructure to develop their networks. To that end, BEREC has built a series of relevant scenarios with different weights attached to the construction of own physical infrastructure, the use of telecommunications physical infrastructure, and also the use of non-telecommunications physical infrastructure, such as electricity, transportation, public bodies, municipalities, and so on. The main means that that we found out that operators used were either through building their own physical infrastructure or using a combination of the aforementioned means, albeit in different areas. Another aspect that the draft report details on is NRA's analysis of physical infrastructure in the context of market reviews, with focus on the physical infrastructure elements taken into account, the stage in the procedure in which the physical infrastructure was considered, as well as the timing of the market reviews. So whether there is the decisions have been already adopted, whether they are under consultation, or whether this is a forward-looking plan, as well as the feedback related to the decisions. So essentially, what was the feedback from the Commission, or whether the decisions have been challenged in national courts. Another point that we were interested in was to get insights into the data collection for the purpose of market assessments from the non-telecommunications owners of physical infrastructure. And of course, the most important portion of the report is dedicated to the remedy setting, that details on the concrete obligations that have been imposed. And normally we do see a full set of remedies when an operator was deemed with SMP in a PIA standalone market, or when the SMP operators in different relevant markets operated physical infrastructure which was deemed adequate for the rollout of very high capacity networks. We also have special sections dedicated to pricing of PIA, the transparency obligation, as well as the quality of the SMP offer as regards physical infrastructure access. Quite importantly, the draft report also addresses the interplay between symmetric and asymmetric regulation of physical infrastructure access, with a straightforward finding that the NRAs assess the opportunity of establishing ex-ante rules, taking into account the already imposed symmetric obligations. So several NRAs stress the importance of having the SMP regime to fix the malfunctioning of competition in their national contexts. In any event, one needs to take into account the fact that, considering the formulation of the questions and based on the responses received, the delineating marks in the text may not be so clear-cut sometimes. And finally, there is a section in the draft report that is focused on future challenges as foreseen by the NRAs, with some mentioning those related to the establishment of a PIA standalone market, others referring to the Gigabit Infrastructure Act implementation and its potential to alleviate certain regulatory concerns, and yet others referring to difficulties encountered in data collection exercise, as well as the identified need to harmonize some of the operational procedures across countries. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Here we show you the preliminary conclusions that we came to. First of all, many NRAs regulate PIA either as a standalone market or as an ancillary remedy through the SMP regime, which brings about the discussion on the opportunity of the deregulation of certain downstream markets. The symmetric and asymmetric regulatory regimes are broadly seen as complementary. So they do complement each other when needed, and also addressing the competition issues identified in a proportional manner. For instance, concerns about pricing are typically better addressed under the SMP regime. In that regard, there is a clear indication of the need to keep the SMP regime as a regulatory tool at NRA's disposal. Following up on pricing issues, the draft report shows that there is a high degree of heterogeneity regarding PIA pricing. And this is one of the areas that BEREC identified with the potential for future harmonization. Therefore, in its future work, BEREC would take a closer look at these aspects. Forward-looking, NRAs deemed it too early to express whether this reliance only on symmetric regulation is considered enough. More time is needed for a complete assessment of the implications, and as of today, the views seem split. The other two takeaways, which can already be inferred from what I said before, are related to the challenges raised by getting correct data from the non-telecommunications physical infrastructure owners, and also the identified need for harmonizing a series of operational processes as regards physical infrastructure access treatment by NRAs, such as information availability, conduct towards access seekers, request processing, procedures of inspections, and so on. So next slide, please. What comes next? As it's written on the slide, the public consultation will be open for slightly longer than what we typically foresee in order to let you provide recent inputs. Therefore, we will close the presentation on the 19th of February 2025. The final report is due in P2 2025. And what's also noteworthy about the format of the public consultation is that the draft document does not feature any dedicated questions. But of course, you are free to provide your input on any different chapter or topic discussed in the report. We will be using the EU survey tool for this one. But there is a possibility to upload supporting documents. So in that regard, I cannot stress it enough. If your organization has issued studies, position papers, or any other material that you think that could feed into BEREC's thinking about PIA, also in the wider context of the upcoming review of the regulatory framework, you are welcome to append them to your answer. And finally, please bear in mind the fact that this report is based on data collected as of July 2024, and some aspects may have changed meanwhile. And with this, I thank you for your attention and pass the floor back to the BEREC chair. So, Mr. Chairman, back to you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you all for presenting the documents. We still didn't receive any question in the chat, so I would just like to briefly address that out of 3 questions that we received prior to the meeting, there are 2 questions which fall out of the scope, out of the competencies of BEREC. So I would just like to mention those are questions from Mr. Dan Ion Oprea, Senior Partner and Director at Audi Consultancy Services, on the existence of a media database, which is probably related more to the authorities dealing with the intellectual property rights. And also the question from Mr. Sean Eogan McColgan on the aviation systems, which could have some relation to the frequency management, but is also out of the scope of BEREC's work. The third question is more for the third part for the second part of our meeting. So as I still see no questions in the chat, I would like to pass the floor to our Open Internet Working Group co-chairs, Veronique and Christophe, to present BEREC report on the IP interconnection ecosystem. Veronique and Christophe, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon on behalf of the Open Internet Working Group. More than 2 years ago, the debate on the so-called fair share and also IP interconnection gained momentum. Back then, BEREC decided to look again at the IP interconnection markets. We have now reached the final stage of this project. Together with my co-chair colleague Christophe, we are pleased to present you today the outcome of the public consultation on the draft BEREC report on the IP interconnection ecosystem. The final reports have been approved by the heads at the plenary last week and are available on the BEREC website. Next slide, please. To prepare this report, we conducted an exhaustive data collection exercise in autumn last year. Based on the findings, We wanted to gain some further insights, and we distributed an ad hoc questionnaire to a broad range of stakeholders in May this year. The responses to this ad hoc questionnaire have not been included in the report for timing reasons. Instead, we have summarized the responses in an internal annex, which contains a lot of confidential information. Finally, we conducted a public consultation in summer this year. We received 36 submissions, and we are grateful for that. And we also say a big thanks for your valuable contributions. Throughout the comments received to the public consultation, we often noted diverging views. In particular, internet service providers arguing in one direction, while content and application providers expressed an opposing view. It is relevant to mention that we conducted a comprehensive analysis of the IP interconnection markets by applying an evidence-based approach. Thus, we do not agree with the criticism of some internet access service providers that we conducted an isolated analysis of the IP interconnection markets, which did not consider the impact of large content and application providers in the global internet ecosystem. Next slide, please. Considering the numerous comments received from a broad range of stakeholders to the consultation, we did a thorough review of the draft report, and we amended all but 2 chapters to provide further clarifications to the report. So you can see on the slide which chapters have been affected. In our presentation of today, we will focus on the 3 key chapters of our report, which generated many comments by various stakeholders. And with that, I pass the floor to Christoph, who will present the key findings.
Well, thanks a lot, Veronique, and good afternoon. I hope you can hear me well. I would like to start, please, the next slide. Yeah, thank you. I would like to have a quick look first at the generic structure of IP interconnection issues. Generally, we learned that both sides of the market held each other responsible for causing congestion. Following consultation, we broadened a bit the generic description of IP interconnection issues. Originally, we argued that ISPs could only use a strategic playbook when all interconnection routes are congested. But this is not strictly necessary. Why? Assume an ISP has a tight traffic ratio as a requirement for settlement-free peering. Then, in that situation, a transit provider may not be able to take on additional traffic, as this settlement-free peering might then turn into a paid peering relation. Furthermore, we also provided in this chapter some evidence from the United States. Please, the next slide. Well, here we had a look at the bargaining relation between the different market sides, between the CAPs and the ISPs. The stakeholders very much provided opposing views. In a nutshell, the ISPs argued, well, the CAPs are having must-have content. And the CAPs, on the other hand, they argued, or they pointed to the ISPs' termination monopoly. Very generally, the whole debate about IP interconnection is about large CAPs versus ISPs. But nevertheless, small CAPs can also be effectors. Why? Let's assume a small CAP may use a transit provider. And if this transit provider has to pay to the ISP, in that situation, this transit provider may then pass on its cost towards the small CAP. A quick look at switching issues. Here again, we learned that stakeholders had opposing views on whether the end users would actually switch if they encounter qualitative issues. We, in our report, we provided evidence from Ofcom and from the FCC that in practice, the switching rates are rather low. One reason for this may be that switching the provider involves transaction costs. Another issue that was raised was the number of end users. And here we clarified that the number of end users, first, it is important for the relative bargaining power of an IaaS provider. And secondly, it impacts on the ability to request termination fees. The FCC explicitly highlighted this point. Wrapping up all this, we maintained our overall message. The bargaining situation seems balanced. Please, the next slide. Thank you. And finally, we had a closer look at the relationship between IP interconnection and the open internet provisions. The ISPs argued basically, well, IP interconnection would fall outside the scope of the open internet regulation, and that BEREC would have a too narrow reading of the OIR and the guidelines. But we, BEREC, we held that we did not apply a selective reading of the OIR. Our reading reflects the consistent ECJ case law. And we also held that additional guidance is beyond the scope of our report. Some CAPs had called for such additional guidance. Finally, we saw no need for additional regulation. Basically, the IP interconnection markets do work. Thanks a lot. And with this, I would like to pass the floor to the end user working groups co-chairs Indre and Marina. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. Today we are going to present the BEREC opinion on the market and technological developments and on their impact on the application of rights of end users in the EECC. This topic stems from Article 123, which ensures that the periodical provision whether the rights of end users are in line with technological development should be arranged by BEREC. Next slide, please. The periodical review should be done within every 3 years, and the first opinion was provided in the year 2021, and now we made the second assessment. We were obliged to provide the evaluation at least of several aspects, mainly impact of trends and developments and assurance of free and informed choice. In particular, focusing on ease of switching process, whether those trends and developments have any impact or harm or distortion to the competition, and whether the efficiency of emergency communications was ensured. Nevertheless, we delved deeper than we are obliged according to the EECC, and followed and tried to evaluate those trends and developments that might have an impact to the whole legislation established in Title 3 of Part 3 of EECC. With our investigation, we of course took the questionnaire that was circulated to NRAs. We, as you recall, had the external workshop that was held in April, and this was also a significant part of our work material to assess. And of course, we had an informal call for the stakeholders to assess the views from the market, what they think of this issue, given that no public consultation would be established within this document. Next slide, please. In each of the part, the structure and aspects addressed are as follows. At first, we took a glance to the clarity of EECC and whether the NRAs indicated any kind of challenges related to that. Of course, the actual challenges that stem in the implementation or for other reasons were also addressed in the opinion. And given all those considerations, BEREC took a chance to provide some future considerations, concerns, or proposals, what could go next in order to benefit the end users. Next slide, please. The results of assessment basically can cover and can be as follows. The best practice sharing is one of the aspects that BEREC had concluded, and it also results in the workload of BEREC work program for the next and upcoming years. Other assessments are of four kinds. They might be the proposals to prevent disparities, if such are indicated. There were some risks indicated if that the objectives for the end user benefits might not meet if some changes are considered. In some cases, the clarity is welcome, and in other cases, the advancement of end-user protection is proposed. And all those proposals at high level intention is provided in the Annex 1, where you can find the reference to particular text in the opinion where all the justification is provided. Next slide, please. So we won't go deep into all the document. I hope everyone interested will read that. But what we have observed, that trends and developments indeed have a significant impact on users' rights. They have impacted in technological developments such as the 5G penetration, phasing out 2G and 3G, phasing out copper, which was also presented previously in other report. Legislative developments also have an impact on users' rights, mainly roaming regulation was marked, the Digital Service Act, and the European Accessibility Act. And there is also a number of market developments that also have to be taken into account while assessing end users' rights. But we have to acknowledge that each regulation and each right established in Title 3 of Part 3 might be impacted in various ways, and sometimes not by all those developments indicated. In our opinion, we also touched the upcoming trends and ongoing work that it is done related with satellites, technologies, and in its penetration, focus on the sustainability, artificial intelligence, and raising also awareness about the blurring lines between sectors. Next slide, please. And let's delve deeper, but to the key findings of our opinion and our general observation and key message that stands for the whole Title 3 of Part 3, that it is future-proofed ensuring that end users' rights are upheld despite ongoing developments in the electronic communication sector, and in most cases, the framework robust structure allows it to adapt to new challenges and technological developments. And as I mentioned before, there are some areas that we could focus on in order to seek better solution for the end users, but we also we have to bear in mind that our proposals are not legislative proposals. Our proposals basically cover the issues that we should have awareness of and that might be beneficial for the future discussions in the review of EECC. And with this, I hand the floor to my dear colleague Marina to summarize some of the aspects in the opinion deeper.
Thank you, Indra. Good afternoon, everybody. So I will go briefly to the most important points from our assessment, which is described in detail in our opinion. So BEREC proposes that regarding clearness, terminology among different legislation should be unified. Regarding informed choice, we are pointing out importance of quality of service parameters and tendency towards simplification of offers of operators to the end users. Regarding concluding the contract, we identified information overload. And also, we think that we should find a more balanced approach regarding rights and obligations of operators and end users related to rights of operators to introduce in-contract price increase clauses, especially regarding indexation clauses. So we have a part regarding rights of termination of the contract and maybe reducing the maximum duration period. Then also what is important are bundle services, which also we think that there should be more rights regarding termination of the bundle services, especially when one part of the bundle services is not correct, especially equipment. Then we think that the same rights should be granted when electronic communication service is used in Internet of Things. We are talking about SIM and rights of end users to switch internet provider, not only in cars, but in things, in equipment in general. Then we identified the great impact of 2G and 3G switching off, especially when technology is changed and end users have to change their equipment, so it shouldn't be on burden of end users. Also 2G and 3, next slide, please. I'm moving on, thank you. So 2G and 3G is also important regarding emergency communications. And also what I mentioned in previous slide, I forget to mention here, we are emphasizing quality of experience parameters, which we also think that are very important, and it will add extra value to the end users if measured and published. So moving back to emergency communication, we as BEREC propose resolving problems regarding caller location criteria and also a common approach to standards that are used. Regarding additional facilities, so we think that flexibility should be in order, but also some mandated measures should be here, especially regarding itemized bill and cost control, but you can read everything in our opinion. And what we identified are activities regarding fraudulent activities and scam. And you heard at the beginning that we are planning a workshop on fraudulent activities. So we propose that common approach should be in order here. Also regarding accessibility assessment, now we have our European Accessibility Act, and some readjustments are required, but nevertheless, we have to ensure that accessibility remains a priority in all times. And even though the new technologies can help users with disability, but it can also reduce the human interaction, especially when there is some problems and there is not any solution when system fails. Also, we think that some new services should be like a mainstream, not only for users with disabilities. Also, regarding the redress part, we identified that most of NRAs are resolving disputes between end users and operators. And this is a valuable source of information from the market. And that indicates to NRAs so that where there are problems and what problems should be resolved. Also, at the end, regarding harmonization part, we think that harmonization gives a legal certainty, but nevertheless, member states have to have flexibility in order to address and resolve some specific problems due to their national circumstances. So that is the part from the end users, and we invite you to read our document, especially because European Commission has to take into account BEREC opinion when making legislative proposals. So thank you everybody for listening, and now I pass the floor to another working group, Remedies and Market Monitoring Working Group. Thank you.
Thanks, Marina, and good afternoon to everybody. We have 2 points from the RAM group, and both are related to connectivity KPIs. So the first one, next slide, please, relates to the report on connectivity indicators for the Digital Decade Policy Program. KPIs relates to the Digital Decade Policy Program, and they were set out by the Commission to monitor member states' progress towards general objectives, the so-called trajectories of the member states. Just to have a bit of background, there has been interactions between BEREC and the Commission before the Commission in June 2023 published the implementing decisions setting out the KPIs, among which the connectivity KPIs, which are the relevant one for the present report. So the BEREC implementation report that the BOR approved in Ljubljana is looking in how the Digital Decade Policy Program and the implementing decisions are implemented in practice by national regulatory authorities or other competent authorities with reference to connectivity KPIs. KPI number 3, which relates to fixed connectivity, gigabyte connectivity, and KPI number 4, which relates to 5G networks. Next slide, please. Just a brief look to the outline of the report. Don't worry if you find in the index the word difficulties as the most recurrent word. It doesn't mean that the process is somehow failing, but it means that since it is the first round of information gathering, NRAs are seeing some technical challenges in collecting data and providing data to the European Commission. So it's normal, since it is an important decision, and it is we can consider it the first implementation phase. Next slide, please. Main findings. Okay, so it's quite important to have a warm-up phase to cope with initial and unexpected issues when actually collecting and processing the data needed for the KPI. In terms of main results that we highlighted in the report, we see progress in comparability. And one of the elements which is providing, let's say, comparability of the indicators is that many NRAs are using the Article 22 geographical studies guidelines for the collection and aggregation of the data, which is a common base. And the fact that the number of NRAs or other competent authorities that are reporting the data directly to the European Commission consultants is increasing, and the fact that these authorities may provide data at a more granular level than in the past, which means, for instance, a grid or address level instead of administrative municipal level. And this, of course, is providing a better level for data quality and more comparability of national results. Next slide, please. So who is providing data to the European Commission? We can see that 21 NRAs or other competent authorities are providing some of all of the data to the European Commission. Only 3 member states are relying mainly on operators. And most of these 21 are responsible for all the activities, from collecting and processing the raw data to aggregating the raw data till a NUTS 3 level and providing the final data with verification, through verification to the European consultant. Next slide, please. Some difficulties arose in the process, and most of all, they relates to definitions of KPIs. For instance, some definitions are missing or unclear, such as the home pass or the definition of rural areas, and some are overly complex, and this points to 5G coverage per different bandwidths instead of the technological neutral way across bands. A further element is that the expected P-time speeds, which is an indicator of quality of service, is a critical issue, especially for, let's say, the border between mobile and FWA services. In these cases where these kind of difficulties are seen by NRAs, these are not able to collect the data fully, and which leads to the provision of partial data to the consultants, and this reduces the comparability of the final of the overall exercise. Next slide, please, with the conclusions. It is important that the KPIs are defined in a way that they can measure the objectives, but are also proportional to the targets and simple to collect in practice. Otherwise, the comparability of the data across member states may suffer because of incomplete results. We, let's say, identified a sort of trade-off between a full accuracy and good enough data collection that should be decided case by case by assessing in concrete terms the benefit added by an extra level of accuracy versus the cost of getting it in practice. And we find it a very simple way to address it to the stakeholders involved, that sometimes less is more, which means that adding complexity to the indicators doesn't necessarily result in more comparability of the outcomes. We see some progress, but also room for further improvement, aiming and simplify practices. And a last point is that the conclusions of this implementation report, which is a descriptive report, will flow both into the update of BEREC Article 22 guidelines for geographical studies, which will be, let's say, leaded in 2025, as Tom already said in the presenting the program, and also that these views is also affecting, let's say, the opinion, which is the next point that I'm going to present, the opinion by BEREC on a future KPI, a proposal for a future KPI. And so this allows us to jump into the next point by the RAM group, which is relates to a future KPI from the current ones, the BEREC opinion on the methodology for the mapping of quality of service coverage on the connectivity indicators for the digital decade policy program. And next slide, please. A bit of background. We had the information about the intention by the Commission to work on a project for something new for indicating quality of service in mobile services in January this year, and we promptly adopt an ad hoc work program item, which is the present opinion. And let's say around July, we had the first draft of the proposed methodology, which is related to 5G mobile quality of service, mainly of 5G mobile quality of services. And this methodology, it stated that is considering the BEREC guidelines on geographical service and also the mapping annex of the EU guidelines on state aid for broadband. We had, let's say, the need for multiple interactions with the Commission, and we posed some specific questions to the European Commission, and we received the replies between the end of October and the end of November. Next slide, please. So if for sure we are in December 2024 for the adoption of this opinion, of this feedback on the first draft of the proposed methodology, for sure we know that according to the timeline, in September 2026, the methodology is planned to be used as the basis for gathering data for the digital decade report for the 2027. So we have a lot of time in between and a lot of next steps already set by the Commission in its proposal. First, some testing, small scale test, for which we thank 4 or 5 member states which are volunteering for doing this. Then a more structured test, consultation with the industry, and all these steps means that they will retrofit, sort of retrofitting on the methodology. So the methodology is ongoing and will be fine-tuned according to the results of this process, and also some recurrent interactions with BEREC are foreseen. So we can say that we have more road ahead to go than backwards, and this is a long process with many chances for BEREC to play an advising role for the definition of this methodology. Next slide, please. Why the methodology is important? Because we all have the, let's say, the focus on the final part of this process, the new KPI, green light. But what will be the new KPI? Could be something like percentage of populated areas covered by 5G services with a defined quality of service reference level in terms of download, upload speed. Okay, so we need a quality of service level agreed among the member states, and the proposed methodology is the one who is going to measure the 5G quality of service. So this is the first step, but is a significant step which will affect the whole process through the definition of a threshold and through the assessment of the new KPI. Next slide, please. What you will find in the opinion, some introductory remark. The proposed draft methodology is part of an ambitious plan by the European Commission. Not only the adoption of the new connectivity KPI within the Digital Decade Policy Program to improve reporting and comparability, but also something which will be used for the purpose of state aid assessment. And we propose this to call this a sort of multi-purpose approach. And also a quality of service indicator, which is based, according to the proposal, on a pure theoretical modeling. In principle, BEREC welcomes the ultimate goal of the methodology, which is to increase the harmonization in terms of evaluating and reporting 5G coverage, also in terms of network expected performance. And we think that the complex timeline emphasizes that a fruitful cooperation between BEREC and the European Commission is the basis for the further work which is necessary on the methodology before its adoption. At this time, BEREC prefers to focus its first opinion on the goals of the proposal and on the likely outcomes, and while details on technical aspects will follow as long as the draft methodology will be commented by stakeholders and preliminarily tested. Next slide, please. A very quick assessment of the goal, proportionality between goals and instruments. Various purposes, monitoring the DDPP and the state aid, and this itself raises critical challenges and could lead to the undermining of other regulatory processes that are already in place, other measures by member states. A general question, will the proposed methodology, theoretical one, be a reliable information for end users? We, as BEREC, considers essential to ensure that the tools and the methodologies deployed for various objectives are tailored to the specific purposes in order to avoid some inherent trade-offs in terms of goals, instruments, flexibility, costs, and timing. As already announced, BEREC will start updating the guidelines on Article 22 broadband mapping in late 2025. And this is an opportunity for further alignment of the NRA approaches, increasing comparability, but also to work in parallel with the Commission and explore possible synergies. Next slide, please. Even if we did not go deeply into technical details, we addressed some doubts and preliminary concerns in terms of sorry. I went to the last slide. In terms of cost and timing, this is an important part of the opinion. We are aware that the proposed methodology may require substantial investments by the operators and most of all by NRAs for the cost of simulators, for the maps and the resource training. This is why we welcome the planned detailed consultation with mobile operators. And we are convinced that the small case tests and each kind of tests will bring very important practical findings for fine-tuning the methodology through, let's say, exchange of views. We consider that the currently proposed draft methodology thus should not be adopted without further tests. And we consider that the present opinion is to be considered as a preliminary advice by BEREC to the European Commission, and more accurate and specific comments will follow. Next slide. Say, even if we didn't go deeply into technical details, we try to address some preliminary doubts and concerns. One is related, okay, how to put together theoretical models and complementary crowdsourcing measures, if they are needed, a sort of verification in order to give an accurate information to end users, but also that some trade-offs between the level of accuracy on one side and the level of burden posed on NRAs to gather data and calculate the indicators are still evident in terms of definition of cell loads or the grid rasters definition, the borders between mobile and 5G FWA, and propagation models, how to take into consideration past investments by NRAs in software, and etc., etc. So next slide and conclusions. In pills, BEREC considers that the current proposal should not be adopted without prior testing and consultation with MNOs. The present opinion aims at advising the European Commission focusing on its core elements while the drafting process is still ongoing. BEREC would welcome a simpler approach that can better achieve the objectives of increased comparability across member states. And we are aware that in Europe, NRAs have not the same size and budget, and so a common goal should be to find a way to reduce administrative and monetary costs in order to apply the proposed methodology. This opinion is a basis for the further work in tandem with the Commission in next year and even in 2026, starting, for example, also from the update of Article 22 BEREC Broad Mapping Guidelines. This is all, and I give the room back to Tonko. Mr. Chairman, it's up to you.
Thank you very much, Marco. Before we start with the second Q&A session, I have some additional updates on our recent activities. Next slide, please. So in addition to the reports that we presented, I would like to mention some other documents that were adopted, and for example, BEREC Report on machine-to-machine and permanent roaming, also BEREC Regulatory Accounting in Practice Report for 2024, then our opinion on the national implementation and functioning of the general authorization regime, and our draft summary report on internal workshop telecom regulators' role in the development and implementation of sustainability indicators in the ICT sector. We also published reports on the outcomes of the public consultations of other reports that were presented. So please check all these documents and other documents on our website. Next slide, please. Well, here is the composition of our working groups and their co-chairs. Veronique, who presented earlier today, is leaving Open Internet Working Group, and our colleague from BIPT, Amélie von Moltke, will replace her. And both Katerina and Sandrine are leaving Sustainability Working Group, we will have two new co-chairs, Mr. Tom Nico from ARCEP and Maris Arantopoulou from EETT. I would just like to thank one more time to Veronique, Sandrine, and Katerina, and you will have a chance to meet our new co-chairs at the BEREC Stakeholder Forum, if not even before. Next slide, please. So we are currently waiting for the approval of the European Commission, and after that, we expect the positive opinion, and we are ready to sign working arrangements with Underceti from Moldova. So we hope that on our next plenary, which is scheduled for March 2025, we will have another member at the table. Next slide, please. Just a reminder on upcoming public events. So in Q1, we have workshop on digital services, eco-design for greener networks and ICT. Then we will have our first public debriefing online on 20th of March 2025. And I mentioned on the 1st of April 2025, but we are serious on this. This is not an April Fool's. We will have our 13th BEREC Stakeholder Forum in Brussels at DEC. Next slide, please. So the public consultations on the reports presented in the first part of our public debriefing on draft BEREC report on infrastructure sharing as a lever for environmental sustainability. The deadline is 26th of January. Draft BEREC Progress Report on managing copper network switch off till 21st of January next year, and draft BEREC report on the regulation of physical infrastructure access till 19th of February 2025. Next slide, please. So now we have come to a questions and answers second part. We have one question received before the meeting. This question is from Mr. Dean Bubley, director from Disruptive Analysis. So the question is BEREC considering creating any connectivity indicators specifically relating to indoor wireless coverage and performance? The EU has billions of square meters of residential, commercial, and industrial property floor space, but little good data on available connectivity types or capability. Most of the value from 5G and FTTP will come from the indoor uses, such as education, healthcare, industrial automation, gaming, etc., but we don't have decent data or targets. So, well, presently, indoor coverage indicators are area outside of immediate focus of BEREC. Given the variety of use cases and solutions for indoor use of services of mobile networks, and also combined with the fact that it is out of scope of license requirements, this also makes a very difficult area for us to dive into. So our immediate task is currently focused on supporting harmonization of 5G quality of service and relevant connectivity targets of the digital decade, which are mostly, well, which are exclusively based on the outdoor coverage. And this was, in fact, presented few moments ago. However, we are aware that this is important context. So if I guess it is too late for the work program 2025, but soon we will open a public consultation and call for inputs on our work program 2026. So you can suggest a kind of work stream or maybe some set of indicators you would like us to tackle. Then the second question is from Mrs. Ines Nolasco from Vodafone. Data sharing between incumbents and alternative network operators was mentioned as a key element for copper switch-off. Can you provide further details? Alexander, would you like to take this question?
Yes, Chair, thank you very much. Yes, as we said, we have, or we describe in the report that information to alternative network operators is indeed of critical importance, and the report describes that NRAs in a large majority and in a larger number than in 2022 mandate the provision of information, and that even beyond the switch-off plan, including, as I said before, also information on replacement technology, identification of lines, information on and changes to coverage, as well as on alternative access products and applicable exceptions. And some of the countries that are most advanced with respect to migration and copper switch off reported indeed, and this is described in the report, that for comprehensive provision of information and transparency as one of the main learnings of their from their switch off, from their vast switch off experiences. And then there was also some of these countries also insisted on the quality of this information and said that it seemed to be most effective in their cases, at least, if the communication was institutional and quite neutral in nature. So this is what I can say for the moment. And yeah, please have a look to the report, and also we look forward to any comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the next question is actually related to the previous one from Mr. Tin Publi. It's not the same, but it has some common elements. So the question is, why focus on percentage of a coverage of populated areas when key 5G value and use cases are in places with low or zero population? For example, agri, ports, energy and mining, road and rail, etc. Also, the population itself lives and mostly works indoors. So KPIs for outdoor-centric coverage are poorly aligned with actual use. Marco, would you like to take the floor?
Well, just a few words on the second part. You already replied on the indoors, let's say, indicator. On the first part, okay, the definition of the KPI is something that it's under discussion with the European Commission, and we think that all the stakeholders and member states can let's say make comments on this in the way to maximize the utility of the indicator in case the population is not considered as the best parameter for checking connectivity. So we take on board these proposal, let's say suggestion and consideration, and we will see. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope that this discussion, which is currently bilateral, will anyway become public at some point. So I'm sure that all the stakeholders will provide their comments. I see no other questions in the chat. So next slide, please. Before I close this public debriefing, I would just like to thank to all of you who were with us through this year. This is my last public debriefing as a BEREC chair. Next year, it will be Mr. Robert Maurik from Comrec chairing BEREC. I'm sure you are going to be engaged and will contribute to our work in all possible way that you can. I wanted to thank you at the end for the good collaboration we had this year, And of course, you can see the links, and you know the links, I guess. So let's stay in touch and see you around. Thank you very much. This public debriefing is now closed or done, however you like. Bye.